Leading a startup team, whether you're delivering a sugar rush, stocking coffee, or getting a regular delivery of snacks, Office Depot has solutions that fit every startup culture, from getting those first business cards and stationery to ordering fleece pullovers with your new logo. To learn how Office Depot and the California Technology Council have partnered to bring you savings on all of these startup essentials and more, go to californiatechnology.org/member benefits. I'm Daniel Levine, and this is the Bio Report. The lack of clarity over healthcare reform, changes to tax policy, and concerns about new pricing pressures are creating uncertainty over the future health of the biotech industry. EY, in its just released annual report on the industry, looks at the effect the growing uncertainty has had on the performance of biotech companies and strategies for contending with what's ahead. We spoke to Glen Giovannetti, Global Biotechnology Leader for EY, about the new Beyond Borders report, what the numbers tell us, and ongoing efforts for the industry to adapt to a healthcare world moving from volume to value. Glen, thanks for joining us.
Hey, it's great to be back, Danny. Thanks for having me.
We're going to talk about the new EY Beyond Borders report, the environment for biotech companies today, and how much of a transformation we're seeing in this long-expected shift from volume to value. Let's start with the numbers, though. The sector seems to be doing well, but revenue growth is down. Are payers to blame? Are we seeing these pressures finally take hold?
Well, I suppose we can say payers are to blame somewhat. I mean, I think, the rate of revenue growth, it was still an overall increase for the population of biotech companies across the U.S. and Europe we track. But certainly that rate of growth has slowed. Partially, I think we could compare to some pretty strong years and a lot of growth over the last few years. So in some ways, success on success and growing off of an ever larger base becomes more challenging just as the numbers get larger. But yeah, certainly I think the broader point of payers continuing to push on pricing and probably more accurately value is a factor. And that's really required companies to think differently about demonstrating value in order to get access to the patient populations that they'd like to be, accessing their drugs.
Early stage venture capital accounted for more than a third of total venture capital raised. That's an encouraging sign. What's driving the interest in early stage funding? Is it a race to get to new ideas? Is it reflective of a broader strategic change as pharma continues to externalize R&D?
Well, I think there's a lot of factors there. First, there's a lot of capital in the VC world right now, which is terrific. As we contrast to, several years ago when we were chatting about, was there really enough funding available for new company formation as opposed to, continuing to fund the existing portfolio. And there were some significant worries about the whole venture ecosystem as it relates to biotech. The last few years have been completely resilient. So while venture funding was down a little bit last year, the last 2 years in particular have been at levels much, much higher than we saw in the decade before on average, for example. So, there's a lot of capital available. A lot of that is in traditional venture capital funds, and those funds have been pretty successful even recently of raising new amounts of money. I think they've benefited from pretty strong returns to their limited partners over the last several years, as we had a pretty strong IPO market there and some nice M&A exits. So, traditional venture capital healthy. We've seen, to your point, much more interest, increasing interest from strategic investors, large pharma, big biotech, who participate in earlier stage investing. getting earlier access. Certainly, big pharma at least is also interested in accessing innovation that's closer to the market and having a more immediate impact on their top line challenges. But clearly, they're also interested in funding early innovation, and so some of that early stage funding comes from strategics. We also point out in the report there's been capital flowing from other sources, from a bit of an east to west, with capital from China finding its way into U.S. funds and Western funds and companies, as well as some direct investment from state retirement plans and other investors that might have traditionally invested through a venture capital fund itself. So lots of capital, I guess, is point one. I think two, though, is the macro trends for investing are quite strong. We've got certainly a lot of unmet needs matched with a lot of excitement in some of the newer technology areas where we're really seeing advances, pretty significant step forward. I'm thinking areas like immunotherapies and gene therapy, for example, which are attracting a lot of interest. I would say that there is some concern around valuation, in the sense of, that's a lot of dollars chasing deals. And so, are the valuations remaining disciplined? I think that tracks a lot, where the public markets are. So as public markets suggest that there's a trickle-down effect to venture, that's something to keep an eye on. But certainly we're in a robust environment. And as you point out, a lot of that's going to startups, nearly approximately a third of it. So we're seeing the front end of the R&D funnel filling in what I would really consider to be a healthy way. I mean, as we know, in drug development, drug discovery, things don't always pan out as expected or as intended. And so, more opportunities, more ideas being funded, I think is a good sign for the long-term health of the industry.
M&A activity was strong, but down from 2015's record. What you are seeing is a drop in guaranteed money on alliances. Does this reflect shifting power at the bargaining table? Are companies getting more on the back end potentially for accepting risk?
Yeah, certainly we saw this year a higher percentage of the total potential deal value in M&A and in milestones. I mean, that's clearly always been the case in alliances. And we've talked in the past about the biobuck phenomenon in alliances. In fact, on alliances, the upfront payments were down year over year as well in the aggregate. M&A, especially among private companies, though, had an awful lot of that sort of risk sharing around future commercial milestones in particular, sometimes around R&D milestones. I think the overall climate for R&D, though, remains robust. I mean, as I was saying earlier, big pharma, even big biotech certainly is looking to the more R&D stage, if you will, pre-commercial biotechs as new sources of innovation, especially those that are, rapidly approaching the market or may have launched their first product or two. So, again, while we were down a little bit off 16, I think off of 15, 2016 was the second strongest year. There's been a couple of decent sized deals so far in 2017. The overall trends point to, strong continued activity in M&A. And, we haven't mentioned it, but, I think the market, at least going into the year, expected U.S. tax reform to be a potential positive in that regard, in the sense of there's an awful lot of capital, a lot of money sitting offshore, held by U.S. domiciled pharma companies that, under the right tax reform circumstances, is expected to come back, be repatriated. Some will go to stockholders, and pay down debt and for other uses. But certainly the expectation is, if that happens, some will be there to fuel M&A activity as well.
Another encouraging sign is an increase in R&D spending to record levels. You note R&D productivity is an area that continues to dog the industry, though, and call current R&D costs unsustainable. What are you seeing done to address this in a meaningful way?
Yeah, I think we're pointing out that it's a strategic imperative and more needs to be done. I mean, there's certainly a lot of initiatives underway, but from the first a comment on it being unsustainable, or maybe even where you started, Danny, with the fact that R&D investment's gone up in the industry is a positive. I would concur with that view. To a degree, that's because there's been, over the last few years, ready access to capital. So that's, what that shows is that capital is being deployed, and it's certainly being deployed, where we would hope it would be, and that is funding innovative R&D. Bigger picture, though, across all of biopharma, we know that as R&D spending has gone up, it hasn't necessarily equated into, more and better drug approvals. So there is a productivity challenge, and if you expect, as we do, that there'll be continual pressure on top-line growth and on margin, the industry does need to face how does it develop drugs in a more efficient way at a lower cost, right? And so, in terms of what's being done, quite a lot, and there's probably more promise from, the application of new technologies as well. It starts with even R&D strategy, and an awful lot of product pipelines today are focused on orphan indications or otherwise narrowly defined indications, maybe because of a personalized medicine biomarker type strategy. The intent there is to obviously address a more targeted audience, perhaps have be able to conduct a smaller trial, also gather that differentiated data that a payer may need. But there's also initiatives going on across the rest of R&D. In particular, can the whole clinical trial process be made more efficient, from enrolling patients to engaging, tracking, monitoring patients, and frankly, strategies to hopefully improve overall yield. And we talked about the early days here of the application of artificial intelligence and the opportunity that AI technologies may have to effectively apply machine learning to hopefully reach better decisions regarding which assets, which molecules to take forward.
You mentioned tax reform a moment ago. There's also the issue of healthcare reform. This is all creating a fair bit of uncertainty for the industry, and we know investors don't like uncertainty. We also have a president that's made pronouncements about drug pricing that could alarm investors. How much is this uncertainty hurting the industry, and is it minimized by dysfunction in Washington that has people taking it less seriously than they might otherwise?
Yeah, well, we certainly agree that we're in a period of high uncertainty related to all those topics. What happens on tax reform? What may happen with drug pricing vis-a-vis the government here in the U.S. If that's one of the levers the administration would choose to pull in order to quote, bring drug prices down, as the president has commented on before. As well as what will happen to replace the Affordable Care Act, if anything. And you're quite right. Investors, especially the generalist investors who try to, predict and grab momentum in a market, do get spooked by uncertainty. I'd say right now, the market appears to be in very much a wait-and-see mode. It's still up from the election. Still, I think, therefore, optimistic about things like tax reform, regulatory reform in general, but clearly in a wait-and-see mode to see what would happen around drug pricing, around around whatever comes to replace ACA. So, one of the reasons we landed on the title we did this year of this year's report of Staying the Course is, I think it's important for companies to focus on and to adjust their strategies for those areas and those things they can impact. So certainly understanding the needs of payers, as they're known today, is critical for every company doing R&D, and most companies indeed are engaged in conversations with payers at a very early stage. It's difficult to adjust your strategy for what might happen in tax reform, or even for that matter, what may happen with healthcare reform. So, companies, early stage companies doing R&D pretty much need to keep an eye to capital availability, but focus on their core mission of developing drugs and adjust their strategy as need be. Filter out is, I think we quoted John Milligan from Gilead. Filter out some of that distraction around the uncertainty that you really can't address. So uncertainty, yes. So far, the market's hanging in there. We'll see what the rest of the year brings.
Pricing pressures aren't going away. You long talked about the shift from volume to value as a way to address the high cost of specialty drugs and explored some models to try this, which can be tricky in practice. This year, you talk about value labs. What are value labs?
Yeah, Value Labs is a concept that a colleague of mine here, a young partner by the name of Susan Garfield, has been developing, and actually the piece we have described in this year's report, she's collaborated with a couple of colleagues in industry, Michael Sherman at Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare, as well as Roger Longman, the CEO of Real Endpoints. And the concept there is one of, giving room for experimentation. Because you're quite right. As we move models from the traditional, fee for volume, with some negotiation, obviously, around discounts, rebates, that sort of thing, to more creative, risk-based models, be they based on financial risk or outcomes-based risk, performance risk, or even to more advanced models, annuity-based pricing, indication-specific pricing, those kinds of things. There's some real struggles for how those will be both implemented and administered. Both for payers, frankly, and providers, as well as for drug companies. And from a drug company perspective in particular, thinking about how these models may be scaled across numerous payers is particularly daunting. So, while everyone sees the trend is towards value, while a lot of healthcare today has a value component, including many services by physicians, for example, these challenges have been a significant barrier to more holistic adoption. And right now, I think it's fair to say most of the time when we see a value-based arrangement, it may be entered into from more of a defensive position where, the pharma company has concluded in order to get access, we need a little more creativity to bridge the gap between desired price and what a payer is willing to actually reimburse. So Value Labs just is a way of saying, can there be structured collaborations between these players, between manufacturers, healthcare systems, payers, perhaps data providers that will help track, analyze, and maybe adjudicate outcomes. It's a real way to say, how do we tackle these issues, make them real, and understand how we may come even to something of a standard, to evolve where a value-based deal is more the norm than the exception.
Well, my sense is that we often hear about these experiments, but not a lot about their success or failure. Are we seeing any outcomes-based payment structures that work, and should part of the role of Value Labs be to disseminate the findings?
Yeah, I think it's early days on most of them. We've certainly seen arrangements made and put into place. The will it work is a topic that I think still needs to have some judgment reserved on it. That they are operating. The broader question is, can they really be scaled? Is the data accessible, trusted, etc.? But yes, I think that's quite right. I think there's learnings for companies, but ultimately, there can be a learning at an industry level or the healthcare system level about what truly is scalable and what can be put in place to make these arrangements more prevalent, right? Because it's in the details where the challenges lie. None of us go to industry conferences or hear commentators from across healthcare resisting the idea that we are moving to a value-based world, and that's probably the right place to be in order to make sure that truly innovative medicines are being reimbursed, et cetera. But how to get there and what that looks like, from an infrastructure standpoint, from a contracting standpoint, from an accessing data standpoint, there's a lot of work yet to be done there. So, so I think whether it's disseminating, the learnings from a particular situation, that's going to depend on the participants. But the hope is that there would be, broader learning and maybe even evolution towards some standard setting.
PDUFA, the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, will be up for renewal this year. Do you see any of the pricing issues playing out in the legislation, or are there other threats to the industry that are lurking out there?
Well, we'll have to see how that plays out, with new leadership at the FDA. I mean, I think, the industry's always desire to have a clean PDUFA, but, there certainly are other factors out there in terms of, perhaps competing goals and priorities in administration that may impact things, the budgetary issues. So there are challenges that will have to be worked through. Frankly, from my perspective, probably a little too early to tell or comment. The legislation has certainly been a success in terms of bringing, over time, in terms of bringing resources to bear on getting drugs evaluated in a timely fashion, and certainly hope that will not be disrupted. I think the broader environment of policy that we touched on earlier, there's a lot of potential risks out there. Again, I think right now it's premature to say, that those will turn out negative or that there'll even be drastic changes. But it does bear watching, and I come back to investors seem to be leaning towards that it will come out generally to the industry's favor, and the fact that the market for biopharma stocks is up since the election, and I guess the question is, how long does the market have patience until they get certainty?
Glen Giovannetti, Global Biotechnology Leader for EY. Glen, thanks as always.
Thank you, Danny. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks for listening. The Bio Report is a production of the Levine Media Group. To automatically download this podcast each week, subscribe to our RSS feed or through iTunes or other podcast manager. To join our mailing list, go to levinemediagroup.com. We'd love to hear from you. If you want to drop us a line or are interested in sponsoring this podcast, send an email to danny@levinemediagroup.com. Special thanks to Jonah Levine, who composed our theme music, and the Jonah Levine Collective, which performs it.